everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Arizona's creation story, important treaties and executive orders regarding Native nations and the Arizona Territory from 1846 to 1912, with Dr. Millicent Michelle Pepion. I'm Maggie Onosorgan, the Public Programs Manager here at the Amerind, and before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge that the Amerind is located in southern Arizona on lands where the Otham, Hopi, Oshwe, Yoemi, and Apache families have lived for untold generations, and whose wisdom and traditions live on today in vibrant communities. We are grateful for what all of these communities, rich in history, have to teach us. We would also like to thank all our members and donors who enable the Amerind to provide these free online talks and fulfill Amerind's mission to foster and promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist the Amerind in supporting its mission in programs by becoming a member or donor, please visit our website, amerind.org. Please also join us next Saturday on November 4th for an artist talk with Dene painter Ryan Singer. And if you're in the area on Thanksgiving weekend, join us at the museum on Friday, November 24th through Sunday, the 26th. The museum will be having a Mata Ortiz show and sale with featured artist Aurelia Lopez, who will be demonstrating her work. And we will also have a book signing with Charmaine Samuelson and her book, Spencer McMullen, Memories, Mystique, Mata Ortiz, a biography on the anthropologist who came across Juan Quesada and the Mata Ortiz pottery. For more details about any events or to register for any of our online talks, please again visit our website events page at amerind.org. Today, if you'd like to ask Millicent any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and we'll gather those at the end of her presentation and have her answer as many as possible. A link to today's recording will be sent to all our registrants and again be available to watch on YouTube. Our YouTube channel, Amerind Foundation, later this evening. So we are pleased to have Dr. Millicent Michelle Pepion as she shares her knowledge about the history of Arizona's creation and the Native nations it impacted. She is Bitterwater clan from the Navajo Nation, born for the Blackfeet Nation. She currently resides in Tucson, where she earned her PhD in American Indian Studies from the University of Arizona. Her dissertation research draws connections between U.S. Census data for Native populations and Native voter suppression in Arizona. Dr. Pepion's survey includes an overview of all 22 Native nations in Arizona in comparison to county and state statistics regarding history, land, law, and representation. Dr. Pepion has developed courses, workshops, and presentations that span topics such as federal Indian law and policy, sovereignty, Native and Western views on philosophy, protection of sacred places, introduction to Navajo literacy and culture, positive Indian parenting, traditional Indian medicine, indigenous methodologies, and writing in two worlds. She has also written a book entitled The Urban Indian Guide to Navajo Language. So we are pleased to have her with us today. So please welcome Dr. Millicent Michelle Pepion.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Maggie. I'm really honored to be here today and to share my work with all of you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat bar and I will answer them at the end. As for right now, I'm going to go ahead and begin the slideshow. And I have a lot of information, so I'm going to go ahead and start right away. As Maggie had stated, my name is Dr. Millicent Michelle Pepion. Of all my titles, my favorite is mom. I have two children. They're right here, Lila and Choctaw. We are all members of the Navajo Nation, but my dad is a member of the Blackfeet Nation, and we're recognized descendants there as well. I do have a PhD in American Indian Studies, but I also have a master's degree in Family and Human Development, which is more of where my heart is, working with Native families. And then I also hold a bachelor's in Liberal Studies from ASU and Associates of Arts from Haskell Indian Nations University. I am currently adjunct professor in the Mexican American Studies Department at the University of Arizona. I teach a traditional Indian medicines course. I also am adjunct professor in American Indian Studies and Chicana and Chicano Studies at Glendale Community College and at Pima Community Colleges. And so this presentation today is kind of forming, if I have any students who are participating, they might recognize some of the slides, but are some of the information from the slides. This is kind of a merging of American Indian and Chicano studies work that I've done for my classes. So with that being said, we're going to jump right into this. My title for this presentation, it does say 1846 to 1912. But as I was creating this, I realized that like those are just time periods that I keep coming back to. And I kind of keep restarting there at the Mexican-American War to the development and creation of the Arizona Constitution and Arizona statehood. But I actually go forward and back from those time periods, as you will see. So today we're going to talk about the Mojave people, the creation of Mexico, and the O'odham peoples, Colorado River Indian peoples, Navajo people, and then a bit about statehood. So this is first is the Mojave people. They are known as they call themselves Pepa Aha Maka, and that means people by the river. This is Spirit Mountain, which is where they descended from. This was their original homeland. If you can see where the Colorado River is, and where Fort Mojave currently stands and where Needles is, the Mojave, and then this is the Mojave National Preserve. All of this area within this map was governed by the Mojave people for since time immemorial, for tens of thousands of years. They were very tall and warlike, as all of the nations that govern large areas. They were very strong people. They were not afraid to go to war. They also had a very distinct look about them. They did tattoo themselves, and they were mostly without clothing, including the women. They were mainly known for being agriculturalists and kind of working with the Colorado River. During the time of the Mojave people's existence or governorship of this area, the Colorado River used to like move back and forth, and it used to like kind of whip around like a snake. And the Mojave people understood how to navigate that system. And so sometimes they would live on this side of the Colorado River, other times they would live on the other side of the Colorado River, but they knew how to farm on both sides of the rivers. And they had ceremonies and stuff to kind of initiate when they would make those moves back and forth. Like I said, they were expert farmers of this region. And the first peoples to encounter or to meet them that was from Spain was Juan de Oyate. I'm sorry if I pronounce these names wrong too. But he encountered them in 1604. 100 years later, 170 or 75 years later, Fray Jose Francisco Garza, he came and they built a little church over there by where it's like present day Mojave Reservation along the Colorado River, and he christened the river the Red River, and that's why it's called Colorado, because Colorado means Red River. And at that time, there's a certain silt that doesn't exist in the Colorado River anymore. It almost made the river undrinkable, but it was a red river. And it was particularly red in the place where they built the mission. And so that's where the Colorado River gets its name from. It's from Francisco Garza. The first American citizen to meet and greet the Mojave people was Jedidiah Smith. And Jedidiah Smith was born in, hold on one second. I'm gonna check here real quick. Oops, sorry. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this slide first. I meant to move these slides around. Okay, so what I want to talk about here first, and I'll get to Jedidiah Smith in a second, was the notion of America moving west. And so if you'll see here like a map of the United States and its major agreements, you'll see the Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803. Texas was annexed in 1845. The area that we know as the Southwest was ceded by Mexico in 1848. And what I want to kind of talk about first, and why I want to kind of briefly explain this before I talk about Jedidiah Smith, is Jefferson, he negotiated the Louisiana Purchase in 1804, and then he sent out Lewis and Clark to kind of explore the West. And so I really like what this Colorado River Historical Society wrote about the pattern of Western expansion, because it does affect Native peoples. But basically, what he says is trappers, and the first order of Western expansion is to have trappers and explorers. That's Jedidiah Smith. And then the second one is to have initial immigrants coming in here from the United States. And those are usually businessmen. And they're usually looking, you know, and also people who are looking to establish like communities, but mainly like business communities where they can make money. The third one is there's an inevitable clash with the Native peoples. The fourth one is the US Army comes in and subdues the indigenous populations. And then the fifth one is immigrants leave the East Coast and follow to the West. And then that starts off like kind of like a small stream, but then it grows into like a river of immigrants coming from the East. And so that's the pattern of Western expansion. And that is where we have Jedidiah Smith come in. If you look over here on this map, and I'm so sorry that it's blurry, but it was kind of like a little smaller map and I wanted to make it bigger. This red area is his first journey out west. And you can see he kind of started over here in the Salt Lake City area. And he went down into Mojave territory, came back around, went back up over here to the Utah area. During these expeditions, he shared his stories about what was happening with him. And he produced like these little booklets, similar to what Lewis and Clark did, and also other explorers of the West. But they would create these like little booklets that they shared with people from the East Coast. And those little booklets would be equipped with like maps, and they would show people like what natives they encountered and what kind of native peoples, what the native peoples of that area were like. When Jedidiah Smith met the Mojave people in 1826, he wrote this about them. The Indians appeared quite friendly, bringing me corn, beans, dried pumpkins, and other produce, which I paid them for in beads, rings, vermilion, and the such. The settlement of the Mojave extended about 30 miles along the river, with them paying some considerable attention to agriculture. After he stayed with the Mojave people for about a week or so. At this point, because they had been traveling through the desert, him and his men, there was only like a few of them with him at that time. They were in need of supplies. They needed water, they needed food. And so they had no problems trading with them. And when they left the Mojave people directed them towards San Bernardino, or present day San Bernardino, which you will have to go through the Mojave Desert, which is a very harsh desert area. And he almost thought that the Mojave people were trying to kill him because they had directed him to go across that desert. When in fact, that area, the Mojave Desert, which is currently the Mojave Desert, from the Colorado River to San Bernardino, it's a very treacherous desert. There's very limited water. The Mojave people had mastered going across that desert, and they have still petroglyphs, like little rocks that guide people if you were to walk through that area, and show people where the water sources are. And so they didn't actually try to send him on his death weren't. They were trying to show him, you know, follow these little trails, you'll be able to get there. But there, of course, there was a miscommunication. He did go back through this blue area is his second route. And when he had come back through this area, through Mojave territory, the people right before him that went through that area had kind of initiated a war with the Mojaves. And so when he went back through the Mojave territory, they weren't as welcoming to him the second time around. But nevertheless, he was able to kind of navigate with or communicate with them enough to be able to get out of that territory without, you know, getting into too much harm. When he traveled up here towards the northwest, he got attacked by a bear and his face got ripped off and he had to sew his like face back together, which he did himself, and he was known for that. They have pictures of him and bear attacks, and that was in one of the books that he shared. In 1831, he positioned himself back in St. Louis, and he let the U.S. Army know that the land out there was like people did live there and that there was a reason to be out there, because he was a beaver trapper. He wanted to go and set up a community out there. And so he got the US government to fund him and give him a little small army. So he had like a cannon and multiple machine guns, and he had soldiers with him. Like I said, the Mojave people weren't the only people who were hostile to him the second time, but there was other native peoples who were also kind of not welcoming to him and his people. So he was really grateful that he had been able to commission an army. Unfortunately, he only made it to present day Oklahoma. He was taking the Santa Fe Trail, and he only made it to halfway through before he was killed by Comanche. He went to leave his troop to go get some water, and the Comanche, they surrounded him and they killed him. That happened in July 1831. And then in December 1831, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. So it's interesting to me that at the same time that we would be removing Indians westward out of the east of the Mississippi River, we would also be going there ourselves and funding expeditions like within that same time period. The same year that we passed the Indian Removal Act was the same year that Jedidiah Smith was able to commission the U.S. Army in order to get troops to help him. So with that being said, before this area was Mexico, and I will go back, refer back to that map that I showed you right here. This was all considered Mexico, including Texas. In the Mexican-American War in 1821, when Mexico declared its independence from Spain, it had largely included all of this land, and they had them documented in their maps as well. And just to tell you how expansive that history is and how far they got, this is a picture of my grandpa's. This is my grandpa, Mountain Chief. He signed the first treaty with the Blackfeet Nation and the U.S. government in 1868. This is my grandpa right here, Billy Russell, and this is his brother, Zach Miller. And if you look real closely at them, you can see that they are not Blackfeet at all. They are, in fact, 100% Mexican. My dad doesn't know the details as to why they traveled up to Blackfeet country in the late 1800s, but it was like a joke among the Blackfeet members that they were that they were written by the census workers as being full Indians. At that time, up until I think it was like the 1970s or something, the census went around and decided what race you were, and they had marked my grandpa Billy Russell and Zach Miller, and there's one of them, they had marked them down as being 100% full Blackfeet Indian. With that being said, when they did come up to Blackfeet territory, the three of them, we don't know if it was because they had stolen cattle or if they had murdered people. But when they did come up to Blackfeet country, my grandpa did welcome them and he gave them a wife. He gave them my granddaughter or his granddaughter. And that's part of the Blackfeet culture, was to trade wives at that time. And so, but yeah, he is my grandma's grandfather. My grandma May was his grandfather. So, just to give you an idea of how far the Mexican people had traveled in the United States, and also how prominent or how substantial their presence was in these Indian communities. This was in 1903, and they went to Washington, D.C. to represent the Blackfeet Nation in U.S. Congress. So, something interesting. Kind of to talk about the United States of Mexico a little bit. The Mexican government was not like the United States government when it declared independence from Great Britain. It was very united. The 13 colonies had established constitutions and systems there. Furthermore, a lot of the people who were heading the 13 colonies were all like, Thomas Jefferson was a lawyer. They all had substantial like educational backgrounds in colonial systems, and they all were very united. That's why we had the United 13 colonies. And even when they established the US Constitution, they did that together. The United States of Mexico, when it was not as conjoined together, it was actually very separated. And the reason for that is because they had a caste system in Mexico that existed from when Cortez in 1521 took down Tenochtitlan, all the way up until the 1850s when Miguel, or 18, when did I say here? 1810, when Miguel Hidalgo rings the bell. This Mexican caste system looked like this. Basically, at the top of the system was the peninsulares, and those were the governors of the different regions. In order to become a governor of a Mexican region, you had to have been a direct immigrant from Spain to Mexico. If you weren't, then you weren't allowed to be in the highest position, and you were considered a Creoles, which was a first or second or third generation immigrant to Mexico. This area of Creoles is what Guadalupe Victoria, and also the person right before him who was like considered Emperor Augustine Itubar. They were both first and second generation Spanish. So they didn't have any Indian or Black blood in them considered, but they weren't allowed to have the highest positions. And the Creoles really are the ones who began the independence movements from Spain. The second on the list, and what we'll get to next, is the mestizos. These were people who had one parent that was either indigenous or Mexican indigenous, and then the other parent was Spanish, either a peninsulares or a Creoles. And they had different designations. So if your mom was native and your dad was a peninsulares, then you had a certain name for you. And then there was other ways, like if your mom was a peninsulares and your dad was indigenous, then there was another name for you. I didn't have time to put those names down, but I will put a link in the comment section and give you guys also this presentation, so you can look up those names, those different designations that they had for people. But it went down to how far, like if your mother was this and your dad was this, then you were named this. The next on the list, the next step on the list was the mulattoes. And of course, they had the African slave trade very much went to Mexico. beginning in 1520s, with Cortez leading kind of that movement into Mexico. They had a steady flow of Mexican slaves that came through Mexico from the 1500s all the way up into through the 1800s, and later even in the 1800s. But we'll get to that in a second. Anyhow, the fourth people on the list was the mulattoes, and then the fifth people were the Native American peoples, and then at the very bottom were African slaves. And so this was the majority of the population. The majority of the population were Native peoples and African slaves. And then also mestizos and mulattoes. These were the majority of the soldiers that fought Spain and also later fought France when they invaded. And their presence, they wanted to get rid of this. And so after the first president, Guadalupe Victoria, was kicked out of office, then Vicente Guerrero, he came in 1829 and he abolished slavery. Vicente Guerrero, it's unclear whether he was full black, like if both his parents were both African slaves, or if it was just one of his parents and then the other parent was Spanish, because his dad did own a lot of land. But if you research a little bit more into his history, his dad was also darker skinned. So his dad might have been mulattoes. Anyhow, regardless, Vicente Guerrero is considered the first Black president of Mexico. And the first thing that he did in office, and probably one of the many only things that he did before he was assassinated in 1831, was he did abolish slavery in Mexico. And that created a system, because this Mexican caste system was so prevalent in Mexico that the Crayolas still wanted to be on the top. They still wanted to, and you see this still in Mexico, where there's still people who kind of talk about how, oh, I'm from Spain, I'm from Spanish. And they'll kind of pronounce that part of their history. And you'll rarely, unless kind of observed, are the people who are Native Americans and who descend from African slaves. They're almost not as proud of that, even though the majority are probably this, because that was the overwhelming number of populations for Mexico. There was very few peninsulares, and where they weren't integrated with the general public as much. And they also were centralized in the big cities, like in Mexico City, Veracruz. A lot of part of the rural populations was Black and Indigenous populations. So even though Mexico did declare independence from Spain, what I kind of want you to get from this is they didn't have that united front that the founding fathers had. And that's because it was a mix of people who were second generation Spanish, who, considered themselves better than the large majority of the soldiers that helped them gain independence. And so I put on here Porfirio Diaz because he was, a dictator in Mexico for almost 30 years. But from 1821, when they declared their independence from Spain, until 1884, when Porfirio Diaz started gaining control of Mexico, they had 75 different presidents. They had 75 different leaders. It was almost like every year someone was being assassinated or exiled, and then another person was getting in. And so they had a lot of in-house fighting, and they still do. And even if you look up Porfirio Diaz, his mom was indigenous. His mom was Mixteca, and his dad was Crayolas. And he considered himself to be more Spanish. He even himself did a lot of things against Native peoples, especially like the Yaqui people, driving them out of Mexico. But he was very much like talked about that Spanish element of his race. And so, you know, the only thing that I can really say that's equivalent to is basically being proud that your family were plantation owners, which is something like you see a lot of American people. Like I remember when Ben Affleck, he did an interview with the genealogy guy on PBS. He was really embarrassed of that. He didn't even want to put it on camera that his grandfather was a slave owner. And I know that he got a lot of pushback from the community, like, hey, you know, if your family was a slave owner, you need to own up to it. But it's so where it's kind of looked down upon in the United States, it's actually looked towards as being something better in Mexico. And so they'll have a lot of people be like, oh no, my dad was a peninsula artist, he was Spanish, he was a slave owner, you know, and they're proud of that. So this caste system still has lingering effects in Mexico today. And there are still oppression with the indigenous peoples and with the Black Mexicans of Africa, which I said they have a lot there. This population from mestizos down is the majority population of Mexico, but it's just been so oppressed by this caste system. But they still have been able to have rulers such as Porfirio Diaz, who was, like I said, half indigenous, and then also Vicente Guerrero, who is half Black. So when we talk about that and we talk about how they weren't united, they weren't, you know, as willing to be friends with each other as the 13 original colonies of the United States. They didn't have that united front. They did have a constitution written in 1821, and then they had another constitution written in 1835, and they had another constitution written in 1846. They had like 4 constitutions, and 75 different presidents. So it was from when they, you know, left Spain leadership to when they Porfirio Diaz, who was a dictator, they just had a lot of changing of hands and a lot of different ways that the people couldn't come together on how they wanted to form their government, which is one of the reasons why it was so easy for Texas to remove themselves from them. And it was easy for US settlers to come in there and say, yeah, no, we're going to take this land, because they didn't have that united front. They had like a whole bunch of like little armies that went around that were, you know, what am I thinking of the word? But they were dedicated to their communities. They weren't really necessarily dedicated to the Mexican government. And so when, you know, Texas was able to annex themselves in 1845, and in 1846 to 1846, they ceded a lot of what is being the Southwest. And a lot of the Mexican people who were on this side, like I said, they denounced whenever they could, similar to here in the United States, Native peoples, whenever they could pass for being white, they did. And the Mexican population still is regarded as being white in the United States. But even more so when the Mexican borderline was created, the people who were on this side didn't have a problem becoming Mexican. I mean, they did have, they fought, of course. There was like rebellions, there's a whole bunch of little battles and stuff. But when it all came down to it in 1848, when the land was ceded, they very much were on this side. And they stayed there, and they created like barrios, which are essentially Mexican indigenous communities that do not have federal or state recognition. But that's something that we talk about in Chicano studies. Anyhow, the Mexican-American War created an issue with the border. It wasn't hard to define the border of Texas because it is the Rio Grande River, the same way with Arizona and the Colorado River. Those are natural borders. But as far as like the lower part where Yuma and Nogales, where those areas are, that had to be further negotiated through the Gadsden Purchase. And so there was a gentleman, Gadsden and Santa Ana, who was the president at the time of Mexico. They came together and they agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for that southern part of Arizona and like a little bit of the bottom part of New Mexico. And then in the following year, President Pierce, he actually signed the treaty of the Gadsden Purchase. So I think it's called like the Treaty of, anyhow, kind of talking about these wars and the southern part of Arizona and its creation. You can see here, Kearney was leading a lot of these battles in against Mexico. And this was the route that he took. He traveled through what is now Phoenix and went down to the Yuma Crossing. These are other routes that the United States Army took when they were battling in the Mexican-American War. Something interesting that I always like to mention is that the creation of this Gila River Indian community, if you can see how it's elongated and kind of to the sideways, it's because the Gila River Indian community and the O'odham communities in general were very nice to the United States armies. They were also nice to the Spanish armies, but in 1846, right at the height of the Mexican-American War, Lieutenant Colonel William Emery reported that the Amiel O'odham, which means the river O'odham people, had generously furnished horses and food to travelers passing through their villages. Mexican War veteran Cave Couts en route to Yuma founded their villages scattered for 18 miles along the Gila River. He observed a series of the finest fields. They were also agriculturalists, and from 1848 until 1855, that's considered the gold rush. But during that time, when there was a lot of immigrants that were leaving the East Coast to go to California, the Amiel O'odham had no problem like feeding them. And it says right here, they supplied starved immigrants and restored their broken down animals. And so this is the first reservation that was created in Arizona. And it was also created like this because a band of natives that were not nice to the United States government was the Apache people. And the Apache people were natural enemies of the O'odham people. The Apache people didn't have they were more nomadic natives. And so they had traveled all the way down. There's like a big battle that was at Tubac. But they were known for traveling all the way up even to Oklahoma. And they had made a lot of enemies for hundreds of centuries before the United States government had come and they began battling with them. But during this time, the Apaches, in addition to the Mexican peoples, which there are Apache groups like La Pan Apache, they're right on the border of Mexico. Anyhow, this reservation not only acted as a place for settlers to go as a haven, it was also a haven from the Apache raiders because the O'odham people knew how to battle them. And so that's why the Gila River Indian Reservation looks the way it does. And that's why they were also given so much of this shoreline. And I talk about that right here. So James Denver, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he established the Gila River Indian Reservation in 1859. I show this map here because, and I'll just kind of go back to this other map of the United States, and I'm sorry I'm like flipping through the maps here, but I didn't want to keep on showing the same map over and over. Back to this picture of the United States. This is how most people learn the United States was created. Like you learn, oh, okay, there was a Northwest Ordinance, 13 original colonies. Florida came over here, ceded by Spain after the US citizens here, led by Andrew Jackson, kind of came through here and fought these battles for this area and this territory. That's why they're Jacksonville, Florida. It's named after President Jackson. And then you learn about the Louisiana Purchase, and for $10 million, you know, President Jefferson gained this land. And then you learn about, you know, Mexico ceding all of this, Texaco separating here. But in this article by Joseph Singer, I like this article a lot, but and it's in the footnotes here, but he says it wasn't like that. And the reason why is because indigenous peoples weren't at the table of all of these negotiations, all of these big, huge land grab negotiations. There were no natives present when they signed the Louisiana Purchase. There were no native presence when they ceded Mexico. There was, and you'll even see like Navajos were surprised. They were like, wait, what? I thought we were by the Spanish people, which I'll get to later. And then they come to find out that they were being run by the United States government. Anyhow, these are all of the treaties that were created to make these lands. And I did put on here 1859, the commissioner created the Gila River Indian Reservation, which they did have to cede lands. And in 1863, Charles Poston, he wrote, "They have been uniformly friendly to our authorities and hospitable to our immigrants. It would be unfortunate if in the eager of rush for farms and cities, the land above them should be occupied and their supply of water reduced." Because he did notice that they were diverting a lot of the Gila River Indian Reservation, the Gila River water to Western settlements. So moving along, it's 11:42 and I still got a long ways to go. Okay, so going on here, kind of backtracking back to 1820. You know, you cannot talk about the creation of Arizona without talking about Mormon influences. Up here is the Mormon Trail. It goes from Illinois all the way to Utah. What they don't show you is that there was a separate trail that started at Utah that goes all the way down into Los Angeles. And it was on this trail that this girl, her name is Olive Oatman, her family were captured by the Mojave people. Her sister actually died in captivity. She was released in 1856, but when she left back here to Kansas, which is where she ended up settling, she told her story. And that was kind of the impetus for the US government to come out there. They were able to, rally the people around her story and also other stories of settlers who had been attacked by Mojave Indians and Apache and Comanche, and bring the US government to come out here. And so in that same year, in that same time period, they started establishing forts in Arizona. And these forts were strategic in their placement. They were not where a lot of populations were. So if there's not a fort there, that means that there really wasn't a threat there. The first fort was created, it was in Fort Yuma. That fort was directly south of the second fort, which was Camp Calhoun. That's now the Fort Yuma Quichon tribe down here. And then you can see there was just a lot more forts that were created from these different time periods. Anyhow, moving on. Going back to Jedidiah Smith, when he had traveled through Mojave, he had left a whole bunch of maps of how to go through the Arizona Territory. The Arizona Territory and this whole Southwest, New Mexico, California, all the land that was ceded from Mexico is mostly desert, and it was largely unpopulated. And it was populated where it was populated. It was populated by small groups of native peoples who were very susceptible to the disease that was in the areas. And so anyhow, when in 1848, the Southwest was ceded by Mexico. Also in that same year, Whipple, he goes down to the Mexican border and he really defines what they want in the Gadsden Purchase. He becomes known for that and known for defining the US-Mexico border, the current border that it is today. And so when he went back to the East Coast in 1853, they were like, hey, we want to bring a railroad through there. And we want it to be along the 35th parallel. They also wanted a second railroad up here, and I forget what parallel this is, but it would basically go through the Dakotas and Montana. But they were really interested in this south route, the 35th parallel route, and that's because of the weather conditions. The way that the weather was working, you can build a railroad through the winter times, and and there wasn't that much of a winter time. So Whipple came through there, and he clearly he was a topographer for the military, and he designed this route, which would later become Route 66. And it travels along the 35th parallel. Also along this time, General Eli Parker approves the Crit Reservation. And because this railroad goes through the reservation, the Colorado River Indian Reservation used to be huge. It used to go like the Colorado River Indian Territory used to be big. And so what they did was they divided the Mojave people into two different groups, the Colorado River Indians and the Mojave Indians. And then they put a railroad through there later in the 1905. This is Iritaba, and he was the native who went to Washington and met with President Lincoln to negotiate these deals. And I put over here a picture of how the reservations look along the Colorado River. And you can see this I-40, which is Whipple's Road. And right here is the Chemehuevi tribe. Up here is the Fort Mojave tribe. And then down here is the Colorado River Indian tribes. So the agreements between these tribes was this would be majority Fort Mojave people. And they wanted to stay closer to Spirit Mountain. They also wanted to stay closer to, they have a sacred site here. They call that Bullhead City, but it's a pillar in the lake that they believe used to go straight up and led to their god. And so there was a group of Mojave that wanted to come up here and stay next to their sacred places. And then there was another group, mostly Mojave people, who said, we don't mind going down further down the river if you guys want to build a freeway, or if you guys want to build, well, what would become a freeway. If you guys want to build railroads up over here, we'll come down here. And the negotiation was, if they would come down here, not only would they be Mojave, but they would also be Chemehuevi. And then later Navajo and Hopi were added, but that's a separate talk. Anyhow, this is the Chemehuevi Reservation. It is in California. The Chemehuevi people do not have a reservation in Arizona other than what is part of the Colorado River Indian tribes. And so those two tribes were negotiated in this settlement here. These settlements were created largely by presidents. And so the Colorado River Indian tribes, part of it was created by Ulysses S. Grant. Another part of it was created by Woodrow Wilson. And something significant about that is between 1855 to 1990, the United States presidents, under executive order, had set aside 23 million acres of land for Indian reservations. And in 1919, Congress was like, okay, not allowed to set up reservations anymore. That practice is going to be taken away from you guys. But it was because they were influencing, expanding, and contracting a lot of Indian reserve lands. But moving on to the Navajo Nation, I will leave this up here, but this is basically how our creations of our Navajo mountains were made. You could see like the first mountain was made out of white shell, and they used a bolt of lightning. And then the second mountain was made out of turquoise. And we have 4 sacred mountains. None of them are on the Navajo reservation. But what's significant about the Navajo people is that they were the first people to be subject to the pacification by the U.S. Army. The Gila River Indian community was almost kind of a neighbor to them. But the Navajo people were largely by themselves in the north. As you can see here, these are the first 4 counties that were created, and like this Yavapai County is like one big, huge county. This Mojave area, there was a lot of interest here because they wanted to put the railroad here. And then down here, Fort Yuma with the border, but up over here, Navajo, they really didn't have that area secured until like the later 1850s. So in 1851, they established the Fort Defiance fort, and Navajo people immediately started resisting that, even though in 1849, there was a colonel by the name of John Washington who had gone in there to Canyon de Chelly and fought a battle there and really established U.S. Army presence in that area. That when they created the Fort Defiance, they didn't really visit it. They like just kind of left it there. And so Navajo people would go and raid Fort Defiance all the time. And one of the big raidings happened in 1856. And so when Kearny, who is one of the leaders of the Mexican-American Army, when he came into power, he wanted to put Karson in charge. And Kit Karson was one of his main soldiers that he could count on in order to subdue Native peoples. And so when in 1863, when Arizona was officially separated from New Mexico territory and it became its own territory, then it was very much in Kearny's interest to put Kit Karson in this area and try to really clearly define, and let the Navajo people know that they are under U.S. government control. And so Kit Karson is known for all of these things, which I won't really talk about his history that much, except to say that in 1861 to 1863, he did go into New Mexico and round up all of the Mescalero Apache people and move them to Fort Sumner. Immediately after doing that, beginning in March 1864, he went to the Navajo reservation, rounded up 8,000 Navajo people, and then also marched them to Fort Sumner. And this is a picture of what Fort Sumner looked like and the conditions that the Navajo and Apache people were subject to. Our chief, the Navajo Nation chief, who kind of stopped that from happening, who negotiated terms so that we could go back to the Navajo reservation, was Chief Manuelito. And one of the things that he says here is he was holding up 2 fists full of sand. And this is when they got back to the Navajo Nation in 1868. But he said, this is how many white people there are out there. We cannot fight them. There are very few of us compared to them. We have to fight the injustices of our people with education. They have people out there called lawyers, doctors, and engineers, and this is how we will win the battle. Education is part of the answer. And so I just always like to talk about that because I am part of that that group of Navajo people who graduate. We usually end up being the top graduates, or the most populous of U of A, ASU, NAU, all have high Navajo student populations at those 3 colleges. We also have our own college. And if you look at how many boarding schools there were set up in Arizona, you can see that the majority of them, 30 out of 47 to be exact, were instituted on the Navajo reservation. And so the Navajo people are very educated people, which may be the reason why we were able to negotiate all these additional land grabs. So at this time between 1868, when we signed the treaty with the United States government to move back to this small area of the Navajo Nation, since then, we were able to negotiate all of these other pieces of the Navajo Nation, which if you look at the size of the Navajo Nation, you can see how far it extends out. And we are the only tribe to expand during the time that a lot of other tribes lost their land through the allotment process. So we were actually able to like expand by a lot. And if you consider, if you go to this website, Dena'ina Project, and you go and look at the negotiations that we're doing now to farm off the reservation into these other areas, in a way that our grazing rights, we are still expanding very much to this day. So Arizona statehood, about 5 minutes left. I'm so sorry if I'm like going through this. I just been looking at the time so much. But it cannot be told without talking about the Salt River Project. They were very instrumental in creating Phoenix and the capital that we have today, 5th largest city in the United States. That started with a man right here. His name is Jack Swilling. Before that, Arizona's capital was Prescott, Tucson, Prescott again. Anyhow, this man named Jack Swilling, he came down here to Tempe and he found out about this irrigation system that was abandoned by the O'odham people. And he started digging that up and diverting the land, or diverting the river from the Salt River and Gila River to the Phoenix valleys. And you can still go to the Swilling Ditch. It's near the Sky Harbor Airport. They're kind of unsure where it actually is, but the canal system that's by Sky Harbor Airport was the first area that was dug up by the Swilling irrigation project. Also in that area is Mill Avenue, and Hayden, who created the ferry crossing in 1871, and then later the flour mill in 1874. And that's because they had so much agriculture that they were able to grow after diverting the Gila and Salt Rivers, that they needed a mill to process all of that flour. And so he really capitalized on that industry there. Again, there's that quote from Charles Poston. You know, the O'odham people have been so nice to us. In the eager of rush for farms and city, the land above them should be occupied. It's tragic what happened to them. Just another acknowledgement of that. The dividing of the O'odham people is as such. If you look over here at the reservations, this whole area used to be O'odham land. And, you know, we even say it in our land acknowledgement statements, but they divided it up into these separate reservations, the Auction, Gila River, Salt River. Part of the Fort McDowell Indian, they do have O'odham people. They also have Havasupai people. It's kind of like a mix. The Gila River also has like Gila Peeposh populations. There is land that is O'odham communities, like the Ched communities, which are located over here, that are unrecognized. But they really divided up this land, and this was largely done through presidential executive orders, which I have all listed here. So we have President Grant, President Arthur, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, who really established and carved out the O'odham Empire into the 5 separate regions that it is now. And I have this quote here from a lady who just says, you know, the Hohokam, we like to think that this area wasn't populated, but it was. The Hohokam is just an archaeological construct. It's not what the people called them here themselves. The word Hohokam is a word that we use to describe our ancestors. It was a state of being at a certain time, and they are no longer in the plane of existence. But that didn't mean that O'odham people weren't always here. And, you know, just because they were able to discover their canal system that they abandoned for whatever reasons they did, they never left. And so when you also talk about the water here, you have to talk about 1902, William Carrier invents AC. That made Arizona and New Mexico and parts of Nevada all habitable. Up to that point, there was really not large populations of people in these areas. But when he created that air conditioning, the modern air conditioning unit, and then along with all the creation of all these dams, that's when the flow of immigrants began to come here into Arizona and moving to these areas where they were able to sustain agriculture. And I put on here, and I do have to kind of end this, but I do want to put on here that Will Rogers, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation, when he came up here to Arizona to be at the commencement of the Coolidge Dam in 1926, he wrote here, "You've done real good. You got this dam built by using Indians as an ally, right up here, right where the nicest part of the water is. That's where the Indians used to live. They had a nice place there and a reservation. And you decided to build the dam here and you moved them out and put them up way above where they'll not be anymore as a result. You fix them so they won't get any of it anyhow. And you white people have done mighty good by the Indians. You really have. You bring them here today and you won't see them anymore until you have another dedication somewhere. And that's because in the creation of all of these rivers, Native peoples were affected. Our land was affected, our waters, reservations moved. Through those executive orders, Native peoples were removed and consolidated into certain areas. And we were really at the forefront of how the creation of all of these settlements were, including towns like Stafford, Globe, Phoenix, Mesa, Tempe, Chandler, Gilbert, Bullhead City, you name it, there was Native peoples there. But just to give you an idea of how much we have suffered, we look to the Otham people. In 1900, they experienced a mass starvation on their reservation. This was, of course, within 100 years of helping Gold Rush people go through their reservation and survive. By now, in the 2000s, they still have the highest rate of diabetes in the world of any peoples. So, with that being said, here is Article 20, Section 4 of the Arizona Constitution that states that is directly related to Indian peoples. And I will leave you with this quote: "The people inhabiting this state do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated, ungranted public lands lying within the boundaries thereof, and to all lands lying within said boundaries owned or held by any Indian or Indian tribes, the right or title to which shall be have been acquired through or from the United States or prior sovereignty, and that untitled title such Indian or Indian tribes shall have been extinguished. The same shall be and remain subject to the disposition and under absolute jurisdiction and control of Congress in the United States." So with the passing of Arizona's Constitution, it was solidified that the Native peoples, what was not already proposed through executive orders and also acts of Congress, that we ceded the rest of the land. And with that being said, these are links to my work. This is a link to my website here. This is a link to my dissertation, which has nothing to do with this. Actually, the majority of my dissertation is about modern federal, state legislative and county districts in relation to the 22 reservations in Arizona. This work was just what you would call the literary analysis of my 4 manuscripts that I produced. I also have a book here and other stories available for works. So with that being said, I will go ahead and hand it back over to Maggie. It's 12 o'clock.
Hi, everyone.
I had to rush it at the end. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'm sorry. You could have gone over a little bit. So thank you so much for sharing all this. Oh my God, we have to do another one. And I wish they would teach this in schools in Arizona. You have a couple questions that I will pass on through email. You can choose to answer them or not. Thank you, everyone who joined us. And I will send out an email with all of this. Thank you again.